Had a little bit of a technical problem on my end, and so hopefully we have all that taken care of, and I can get back to the class. And I wasn't sure whether or not the class was going through or not, but apparently it was. The encoder continued, even though it had showed that it was dead for me. But as we ended the last hour, we were starting into a study of the primacy of Peter. That Roman Catholicism is one of the three foundational premises is the primacy of Peter. That he is the foremost among all the apostles, that he is the foundation upon which the church was built, and the first pope or universal bishop over the church. And so we want to examine these claims, because if they're true, then Roman Catholicism is true. If they're false, then Roman Catholicism as a whole is false. Well, as we examine the claims, Matthew 16, verses 18 through 20, this is one that is familiar. I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. When Jesus came in contact with Simon, the brother of Andrew, he immediately changed his name from Simon, meaning famous, to Cephas, or Peter, meaning a rock. John 1, verse 42, and Mark 3 and verse 14. So they claim that that thou art Peter, rock, and upon this rock, Peter, I will build my church, is the claim of Catholicism. And I will give unto thee, which is Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou, Peter, shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou, Peter, shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now understand, we are examining the claims of Catholicism here, and this is what Catholicism is going to say. The word key there signifies authority. Thus, Peter himself was given authority pertaining to the kingdom of heaven. Thus, whatever Peter might decide to bind or loose on earth would be acceptable and would be bound or loosed in heaven. But it was Peter, thus, that was the one who was doing that. It is affirmed by Catholicism that Peter was always listed as preeminent or the primary one among the apostles. Even though his name might appear second or last in position of the listing of the apostles, they are saying that he is always given a preeminent or primary position among the apostles. They claim if his name is listed in last place, then there is an ascending scale of importance. One's unimportant are listed first, and there's an ascending list of importance. For example, in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 5 and verse 6. They would claim if listed in the second position, then there is a pyramid arrangement giving special emphasis to the person at the top of the pyramid, as indicated by that second place listing. For example, Galatians 2, verses 9 through 13, that there would be that pyramid arrangement. So you have someone listed first, then a pyramid to the second person, and then coming back down as far as importance is concerned, a pyramid arrangement in that way, thus giving special emphasis to, again, that second person in the list on that occasion, which is Peter. But whenever the apostles as a complete group are listed, then Peter's name invariably heads the list, they say. Matthew, the 10th chapter, verse 2, Mark 13 and verse 16, Luke 6, verses 12 through 14, and Acts 1 and verse 13. There is a listing of all of the apostles, and in that, Peter's name always appears first. True also, except in the noted times of when there's an ascending scale of importance or a pyramid arrangement of importance, when just a few apostles are considered, his name is listed first. For example, Matthew 17 and verse 1, and the parallel Mark 9 and verse 2, you have Peter, James, and John. Luke 9 and verse 28, Peter, John, James. Matthew 26, verse 36 and 37, and the parallel in Mark 14, 32 and 33. In Mark 5 and verse 37, with its parallel in Luke 8 and verse 51. Mark 13 verse 3 and verse 4. And Luke 24 and verse 12, and its parallel might be John 20 verse 2 through 8. So when just a few apostles are considered, Peter's name always heads the list, except, again, those noted times in which you have the ascending scale of importance or a pyramid arrangement of importance. So that's the claims of the Roman Catholics to set forth the primacy of Peter, that Peter is the primary one as far as the apostles are concerned, and thus the church is built upon Peter, as we noted in Matthew 16, verse 18, that upon this rock, Peter, I will build my church. Now then, let's test and let's notice what the Scriptures actually teach concerning this. In Matthew 16, verses 18 and verse 19, in order to fully understand the teaching of these two verses, we have to really consider the entire context, which goes back to verse 13 and goes through verse 19. The discussion that is being set forth by Jesus within these verses and within the context is not who is Peter, but the discussion is, who is Jesus? He asked them, who do men say that I am? And they give him an answer. Some say that you're this or that. Who do you say that I am? So it is a discussion of Jesus, not Peter. Peter's given name actually was Simon, but when the Lord met him, he changed his name from Peter. And from that day forth, Peter generally was known according to his new name, Peter. In like manner, Christ's given name was Jesus. But he also was given another name, the name of Christ. Thus, Jesus, in speaking about the foundation upon which the church would be built, makes a play on words and ideas. Thou art Simon, called Peter. I am Jesus, called Christ, the Son of the living God. He's making a play on that idea and those words. Your given name was Simon, but I'm calling you Peter. I've changed your name to Peter. Was given the name Jesus, but I am called Christ. I am the Son of the living God. And so he's making a play on words. Notice the text, though, in the original, or the Koine Greek language. In the original, there is a decided difference between Peter and that rock upon which the church would be founded. Thou art Peter. It's the Greek word Petros, masculine gender. Could be translated and means a rock or a pebble, a stone, and translated into our English as thus Peter. And upon this rock, you have Petra, feminine gender, as opposed to masculine gender when he mentions his name. And Petra, the feminine gender, means a bedrock, a mountain or rock, an immovable ledge, and translated into our English as a rock or stone. Now then, the Catholic rebuttal to this argument of these two words in the Koine Greek, Petros and Petra, is that our Lord spoke in the Aramaic language. and reference is made to the Pesheto-Syriac translation where the neuter gender Kepha is used for both Petros and Petra. And thus, thou art Kepha, and upon this Kepha I will build my church. And the same neuter gender is used in both places. And thus, in the Aramaic, there is no gender change, and thus Jesus is saying that Peter is the rock upon which the church is going to be founded. But very basically, there's no basis, either from biblical history or secular history, for accepting the theory that Jesus spoke in Aramaic on this occasion. And in fact, the evidence is to the contrary. When the Bible records a direct quotation from language, we find the phrase being interpreted found. For example, if you look in Matthew 1 and verse 23, Mark 5 verse 41, Mark 15 verse 22, John 1 and verse 38 and verse 41, Acts 4 and verse 36. And thus, if it was a direct quotation from the language, it would say being interpreted. You would have that phrase being used. Second, the Latin Vulgate, which is accepted by the Roman Catholic Church as an authorized, infallible version. Understand that because it's important. The Latin Vulgate, according to Roman Catholic Church, is an authorized, infallible version. Well, guess what? It makes a distinction in gender. Petrus, masculine, and Petram, feminine. Thou art Petrus, masculine gender. And upon this Petram, feminine gender, I will build my church. And thus, by their own authorized, infallible version, the Latin Vulgate, you have that distinction in gender. Matthew, however, as was true of all of the New Testament writers, wrote by inspiration of the Holy Spirit in the Koine Greek language. And he made a difference between Peter and the rock. He made that gender change from the feminine gender or the masculine gender to the feminine gender. Thou art Peter, Petros, and upon this rock, Petra, I will build my church. But if we didn't have that even, other scriptures give us emphasis or emphasizes the fact that the church being built upon a Petra, not Petros. Let's just, for a second, if we wanted to, set forth that the church is, or that Jesus spoke in language that does not have those distinctions. And now then we come to what would we do with it? Well, let's look at other passages. Turn over to Romans, and my Bible program crashed. In order to keep on going, I'm got to get my regular Bible out. So turn over to Romans 9 and verse 33. And it says there, as it is written, Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone, and rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. Now this goes back to Isaiah 8 and verse 14 and Isaiah 28 and verse 16, but he uses two words here. Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone. The stone there has reference, it comes from the Greek word lithos, and a rock, Petra, of offense. Petra, feminine gender. And so you have that feminine gender Petra that the church is going to be built upon. That stumbling stone, that rock of offense, and that Christ is that Petra and not Peter. Turn over to 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, and verse 4. You have, and all, here you have Paul going through the Israelites, and that they were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all baptized in Moses in the cloud and the sea, all did eat that same spiritual meat. And in verse 4 he says, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So here you have it, that rock being Christ, not Peter. Again, in Ephesians, the 2nd chapter and verse 20, and specifically in the Westcott and Hort text, you would see this aspect, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone. Christ is the cornerstone, not Peter of the church. Now then, let's go to Peter himself. Does Peter testify to this? Well, turn over to 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, verses 4 through verse 8. And he says, to whom coming as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious. Ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Wherefore also it is contained in the Scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he that believeth on him shall not be confounded. Unto you therefore, which believeth, he is precious. But to them which be disobedient, the stone which the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense, even to them which stumble at the word, being disobedient, whereunto also thou wert appointed. Here, Peter uses both of these Greek words, lithos and petra. Lithos would be L-I-T-H-O-S, and petra, P-E-T-R-A. Notice in verse 4, you come unto the living stone, that's lithos. Verse 5, as living or lively stones, lithos. Behold, I lay in Zion, verse 6, a chief cornerstone, lithos. That's elect, precious. He that believeth on him shall not be confounded. Verse 8, a stone, lithos, of stumbling, and a rock, petra, of offense. You come unto Jesus Christ. There's that rock of offense. There's that stone of stumbling. He is the petra, not Peter. Why didn't he say me? I'm the stone of the rock of offense. Because he wasn't. The petra upon which the church is going to be founded is Christ, not Peter. Christ is the petra, not Peter. And you might tie in with that these other passages from the Old Testament dealing with this, Psalm 118 and verse 22, Isaiah 8 and verse 14, Isaiah 28 and verse 1, and we read just a moment ago, Romans 9 and verse 33. Really, these scriptures that we see here are paralleling what Paul wrote in Romans 9 and verse 33. Now then, also consider Acts the 4th chapter. And in verse 11 and 12, here Peter speaking again. And he is talking to the high priest and the council. And he says that this is the stone which is set at naught of you builders, which is become the head of the corner. Who? Christ, whom God raised from the dead, verse 10. And by his power this man is standing here before you whole. And then, neither is there salvation, verse 12, in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. Now, Roman Catholicism says, no, that's not the case. It is Peter by which we're going to be saved, not Jesus, in effect. That Peter is the head of the church, not Christ. And then in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 11, Paul says, for other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Christ Jesus. What's the foundation of the church? It's Christ, not Peter. Peter's not the foundation of the church. There is no foundation that can be laid other than Jesus Christ. Also, when we go back to Matthew, the 16th chapter, and we look at that, whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. This was given to Peter. That statement is made to Peter. I will give unto thee, Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever thou, Peter, shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth, thou, Peter, shall be loosed in heaven. But we need to understand that ability to bind and loose was not given exclusively to Peter. If you turn over to Matthew 18 and verse 18, verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. There is a ye. Most brethren believe that has reference to all of the apostles. I think the context shows that it is dealing with the church as a whole. If it's dealing with, starting back in verse 15, if your brother trespass against you, go to him and tell him his fault. It's between you and him. If he hears you, gain your brother. If he will not hear, take 2 or 3 witnesses, that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. If he neglects to hear them, the 2 or 3 witnesses, tell it to the church. And if he neglect to hear the church, let him be as a heathen man, as a publican, for whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. I think the context, I can see where others view that as being the apostles, but I think it has reference to the church as a whole there. But also, turn over to John the 20th chapter, and in verse 23, it states that this Jesus appears to his apostles, and he says, verse 22, receive ye the Holy Ghost. Whosoever sins ye remit, they are remitted unto them, and whosoever sins ye retain, they are retained. So here, all of the apostles are given that ability to bind and loose. But going back now to Matthew 16 and verse 19 in particular there, whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. When we look at that, it is not saying that Peter and the others texts, the apostles or the church, could bind and loose on earth. What it is saying is, what has already been bound or loosed in heaven is what you are to bind and loose. In other words, God has already made a decision as to what is bound and loosed. What is Peter to do? What are the other apostles to do? What's the church today to do? It is to bind and loose what God has already been bound, or what God has already bound and loosed. The Greek tense here is literally shall have been bound and shall have been loosed in the heaven. So whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall have already been bound in heaven. Whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall have already been loosed in heaven. That's what it's saying. The binding and loosing is done by God, not by Peter. The Bible, and we won't read these or go through all of these verses, but the Bible has never endorsed the primacy of Peter or any other apostle. Read and study Matthew the 18th chapter, verses 1 through 4, Matthew 19 and verse 28, Matthew 20, verses 20 through 28. There they are arguing as to which of them was be the greatest. And Jesus sets a child in the midst of them and says, whoever is going to be greatest, let him be your servant. Matthew 23, 1 through 12, Mark 9, verses 33 through 37, Luke 9, verses 46 through 48. Now then, bear in mind that all of these discussions that I just mentioned, all of these passages, in all of these discussions, all of them took place after the events of Matthew 16 and verse 18. And yet, the primacy of Peter is not endorsed in any of those verses. If Peter would have been the one who was had the preeminence among the apostles, why wasn't it set forth in those other occasions? Next, Paul, the Apostle Paul, ever stands as an indictment against the primacy of Peter. Galatians, the 2nd chapter, verses 6 through verse 14, sets forth Paul rebuking Peter to his face because he was to be blamed. Also, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 28, and tie in verse 5 with that, along with 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 19. Paul, by the Spirit, gives a detailed list of the officers and servants in the church. Yet he fails to mention either the primacy of Peter or the papal office itself. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 28. Why didn't he mention, here's Peter. He is the Pope. He is the first of the long list of popes. In Ephesians, the 4th chapter, verses 11 through 16. Again, there's that idea of the offices of the church, servants in the church, yet nothing mentioned about the primacy of Peter or the papal office, either one. There is never a mention of the papal office in the Scriptures. Now, why is it that the silence of the Scriptures, if the office is so important, why would it not mention it? Here's the spiritual well-being of the church in relationship to its continuance, and while dealing with the offices in the church, this most important office is not even mentioned? That doesn't make sense. Consider the epistles of Paul, or the epistle of Paul, written to and from Rome. The Roman Catholic Church claims that Peter was Pope in Rome from AD 42 to 67 or 68, whenever his death occurred. During this same period, Paul wrote one epistle to Rome, and probably 5 epistles from Rome. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon were all written from Rome during Paul's first imprisonment, which would have been 61 to 63 AD. 2 Timothy was written from Rome during Paul's second imprisonment, AD 67. Now then, you have 6 epistles, 1 to Rome, 5 from Rome. No mention of Peter in any of these epistles. Now, if Peter had been in Rome during this time, then either he had forsaken Paul during his imprisonment, which we would find in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 16, all men have forsaken me. Then you have Peter forsaking Paul during that second Roman imprisonment. But there's no mention in any 6 of these epistles of Peter. The Roman letter was written by Paul in 58, or AD 58. In this epistle, he mentions 27 people by name, but he does not mention Peter. Wouldn't it seem strange that here he is writing to Rome, and supposedly Peter is in Rome, he is the head of the church, he is Pope, and Paul, in writing a letter to that place where Peter is supposedly at that time and is the ruler of the church or the head of the church, and he doesn't even mention him by name? This would have been not only in bad taste, it's unthinkable if Peter was Pope in Rome during this time frame. Also, Paul, we find in Romans, the 1st chapter, desired to go to Rome that he might impart some spiritual gift unto them, or miraculous gift. A spiritual gift and the impartation of spiritual gifts was only something that an apostle could do. And it was for, according to Romans 1 and verse 11, to the end that they might be established. Evidently, Peter nor any other apostle had been to Rome or had been in Rome before Paul's letter in 58. Otherwise, they could have imparted those miraculous powers to others. But supposedly, Peter was there during that time, according to Roman Catholic tradition. Now, why would Peter or Paul need to go there to impart miraculous powers to them to the end that they might be established if Peter was there and he was head of the church and pope of the church at that time? In AD 44, we find Peter was in Jerusalem and had been imprisoned by Herod, according to Acts 12th chapter. And yet, supposedly, he's head of the Roman, or he's in Rome from 42 to 67 or 68. So, 42, starting at that point, but now then in 44, we find him imprisoned by Herod, Acts 12th chapter. And he was still in Jerusalem in AD 49 or 50 during the discussion concerning circumcision and the acceptance of the Gentiles, Acts the 15th chapter. Peter writes 2 epistles, and yet he never within these 2 epistles makes mention of his primacy or his papal office. In fact, what we find, we read in 1 Peter 2, verses 4 through 8 just a few minutes ago, how that he would, in reality, argue against any papal office that he might hold, and that Christ was the foundation of the church. He is that chief cornerstone. Also in 1 Peter 5 and verse 1, we see the elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder. Why didn't he say, I'm the Pope, I have this papal office? But he just says, I'm an elder just like you are. And I'm also a witness of the sufferings of Christ and a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. But he doesn't claim any special office in relationship to that. In Acts the 8th chapter and verse 14, it's interesting to note that Peter and John, here, if you will recall, Philip has gone up to Samaria and has converted the Samaritans. The church at Jerusalem hears it. In Acts 8 and verse 14, Peter and John are sent by the apostles to Samaria. Notice that Peter is sent. Notice that phrase, and again, is sent. He does not do the sending. If he was Pope, he would have been the one doing the sending, not being sent. In Acts 11th chapter and verse 2, there the brethren of Judea contend with Peter. Evidently, these brethren of Judea did not know of or did not accept his place of authority, as far as what the Roman Catholic Church would argue his place of authority. In Acts 15th chapter, the Jerusalem discussion over circumcision and the Gentiles keeping the law of Moses. Why didn't Peter preside over this council that was taking place? Instead, it appears as if James had that place of authority, and thus James evidently usurped that place of Peter's authority. Notice in Acts 15 and verse 13, James says, hearken unto me. And in verse 19 he says, wherefore my sentence is. James evidently is usurping the authority of this Pope, if that is the case. But obviously, it's not the case. because the Scriptures very simply do not know of this idea of the primacy of Peter. And if Peter is not, you don't have the primacy of Peter, then he's not Pope. Apostolic succession is ended. The infallibility of the Pope ends. And Roman Catholicism as a whole is destroyed by this one aspect, the primacy of Peter. Scriptures don't know of it. And thus Roman Catholicism is itself false. Well, now let's introduce 1 Peter, getting back to that. And I know I spent a little bit of time dealing with that primacy of Peter and that viewpoint. But I think it's important, and these are things maybe that you won't be able to go just sit down in the Scriptures and read for yourself. And that way this might help you a little bit more. 1 Peter now. It was written by Peter, verse 1, an apostle of Jesus Christ. In chapter 5 and verse 1, he mentions that he is a witness of the sufferings of Christ. Also, a consideration of the second epistle bearing his name gives additional information. 2 Peter 3 and verse 1. He talks about that which he has written before. 2 Peter 1 in verse 1, and then verses 14, and then verses 16 through verse 18. All of them give additional evidence to Peter being that author of these books. By, he says, Silvanus, a faithful brother, chapter 5 and verse 12. As is true of Paul, no doubt Peter made use of Silvanus on this occasion as an amanuensis, or basically a secretary, but the word is amanuensis. That's spelled A-M-A-N-U-E-N-S-I-S. So amanuensis. And you might consider Paul's letters in 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 1, 2 Thessalonians 1 and verse 1 in regards to that. The internal evidence as to Peter being the human author selected by God to write this is really undeniable. It is obviously Peter's work. The external evidence is also most ancient and unanimously cited as authentic. You have Clement of Rome, Polycarp, the Epistle to Diognetus, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, Papias, Hermas, and many others that set forth Peter as being the human author of this work. It was written to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, chapter 1 and verse 1. In the main, these churches had been established by Paul. The churches of Galatia, Ephesus, and Colossae were at least some of those that were established there by Paul. Also, there's a great similarity between Paul's writings and Peter's. Again, for time's sake, I'm not going to read these verses, but I would encourage you to make this comparison. Paul's statement in Ephesians 1 and verse 3 with Peter's statement in 1 Peter 1 and verse 3. So Ephesians 1:3, 1 Peter 1:3. Paul's statement in Colossians 3 and verse 8 with Peter's statement in 1 Peter 2 and verse 1. Paul's statement in Ephesians 5 and verse 22 with Peter's statement in 1 Peter 3 and verse 1. Paul's statement in Ephesians 5 and verse 21 with Peter's statement in 1 Peter 5 and verse 5. Paul's statement in Galatians 5 and verse 13 with Peter's statement in 1 Peter 2 and verse 16. And then Paul's statement in Galatians 2 and verse 4 with Peter's statement in 2 Peter 2 and verse 1. So there is a great similarity between Paul's writings and Peter's writings and what they deal with. When we come to this word, to the strangers scattered abroad, the English word scattered comes from the Greek word diaspora. And whereas James might have used the term primarily for Jewish Christians as we studied and introduced the book of James, Peter no doubt uses the expression for Christians, and predominantly Christians of Gentile origin. And look at the statements in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 14 through 18, 1 Peter 2, verses 9 through 12, 1 Peter 3 and verse 6, and 1 Peter 4 and verse 3. However, in saying that, while it was predominantly or primarily Gentile origin, Christians of Gentile origin, it does not mean that Jewish Christians were excluded from that, as they also must have been included, as we would see in 1 Peter 2 and verse 9 and 1 Peter 3 and verse 6. As to the date or the time of writing, in order to establish the time of this writing, we have to consider two different ideas. First, John Mark. At the time of this writing, John Mark was with Peter in Babylon, according to chapter 5 and verse 13. In 62 to 63 AD, Mark was preparing for a visit to Asia Minor, according to Colossians 4 and verse 10. In 67 AD, Paul urged Timothy to bring Mark with him from Asia Minor to Rome, 2 Timothy 4 and verse 11. This would lead us to place the writing of this epistle between 63 and 67. Second, the people to whom Peter wrote were undergoing severe persecution. As we'll notice in just a moment, the purpose or the scope of this writing deals with this persecution. The Neronian persecution is dated from 64 to 67 AD. According to tradition, Peter suffered martyrdom during the 13th year of Nero's reign, which would be 67 AD. And we mentioned that a little bit earlier. The epistle, thus, would have to be dated after 64 AD, but before 67 AD. So generally, this epistle is dated about 65 AD. The place from where it was written is Babylon. Chapter 5 and verse 13 tells us that it was written from Babylon. However, there's four possible answers that are given as to which Babylon is under consideration here. First, Babylon in Egypt. It was a northeast and very close to the present site of Cairo. A second Babylon would be Jerusalem. Third Babylon that would be mentioned would be Rome, and you could compare Revelation 16:19, Revelation 17:5 and 18, Revelation 18 verses 10 and verse 21 along that regard. And then the fourth Babylon would be Babylon of the Euphrates. And I see that our time is up for our study today. Hope that these things will be profitable to you. We'll start, Lord willing, next week on looking at this Babylon and which Babylon is under consideration. Thank you for your attention and for being here today, and hope that this is profitable to you. Look forward to seeing you next week.